Good morning and welcome to the Point. This past week, we completed one of the most contentious races for the White House in recent memory. Donald Trump was victorious, and early Wednesday morning, he addressed supporters and the nation.
Hillary has worked very long and very hard over a long period of time, and we owe her a major debt of gratitude for her service to our country. I mean that very sincerely. Now it's time for America to bind the wounds of division. Have to get together. To all Republicans and Democrats and independents across this nation, I say it is time for us to come together as one united people. It's time. I pledge to every citizen of our land that I will be president for all Americans, and this is so important to me. For those who have chosen not to support me in the past, of which there were a few people, I'm reaching out to you for your guidance and your help so that we can work together and unify our great country.
Later Wednesday, Hillary Clinton talked to her supporters and the country about her acceptance of the defeat and what it means going forward.
This is painful, and it will be for a long time. But I want you to remember this. Our campaign was never about one person or even one election. It was about the country we love and about building an America that's hopeful, inclusive, and big-hearted. We have seen that our nation is more deeply divided than we thought. But I still believe in America, and I always will. And if you do, then we must accept this result and then look to the future. Donald Trump is going to be our president. We owe him an open mind and the chance to lead. Our constitutional democracy enshrines the peaceful transfer of power. And we don't just respect that, we cherish it. It also enshrines other things: the rule of law, the principle that we are all equal in rights and dignity, freedom of worship and expression. We respect and cherish these values too.
Political pundits and others will analyze and dissect this election for a long time to come, but most important is what happens going forward instead of looking backward. And those were the questions I put to Democratic Senator Gary Peters. Senator, we've come through yet another election cycle. Some might say one of the more unusual election cycles that we've gone through, but here's the end of the day. A Republican president, a Republican Senate by a narrower margin, and a Republican House. What does that mean for governance?
Well, I'm hoping that we still come together. I think, we've been through a very contentious election. Certainly, it's probably the most contentious election that I can remember through the years as watching politics. So we see a very polarized country. It reflects where the American people are right now, that are very polarized. You look at the popular vote. Actually, Hillary Clinton got more in the popular vote, but less in the Electoral College. So this is a country that's split about 50-50. But as I look at democracy and what is necessary to strengthen this, and my concern is always about democratic institutions, that we keep this experiment of democracy vibrant going forward, that folks have to realize that there's two aspects of democracy that have to be in place. First is that we have to have vigorous elections, free and open elections. Everybody's free to express their opinion, to be advocates for their candidate, and to be vigorous. And then two, though, after the election's over, we then have to start a healing process. So we have to start coming together and finding places where we can work together as one people. And so I'm hoping in the next few weeks we will see that process. Hopefully the President-elect Trump will be reaching out to folks on the other side as well, saying let's come together and deal with some of the tough issues that we face as a country. One that I hope is one, and I think we could hopefully focus on this very early, is what I consider a nonpartisan issue. And that's infrastructure. We've got to invest more in roads and bridges and sewer systems and water systems. And that should not be a partisan issue, and yet it's one that we desperately need to deal with. I think it would just send an incredibly powerful message that the Congress is really ready to work together on issues that are impacting folks all across this country.
Well, we were going to get to that, but since you brought it up, I'll talk about it now, and then we'll go back to the other conversation. But infrastructure is one of those areas. I just spoke to a group of commercial realtors, and they wanted to know what's next. And I said, well, think about this for a minute. President-elect Trump has proposed $1 trillion investment in infrastructure over a 10-year period of time. Now, you can argue about the dollars, whatever that's going to be, but $1 trillion investment in something that would impact 435 separate congressional districts and all 100 U.S. senators, and build things that need to be built and put people to work. I mean, that is something that really could be a win-win. The financing is always the issue, and where you find the money. But it's interesting that that's the first place you go, because that was the one thing that I identified where that might be something that members could come together. I mean, the suggestion that I think you just made is, out of this amazingly contentious election and the way the dust settles, you think that progress is possible.
Well, I think it's possible, and I think it's essential that we've got to be able to show progress, and that we are working on real issues that impact families, things that haven't been dealt with because of the partisan nature of the battles that we have seen in Congress. This is a rare opportunity, and could be an incredibly powerful opportunity to bring this country together. You can't sustain a democracy over the long term if we're constantly in the aspect of constantly fighting, constantly not giving any compromise, constantly rolling over people. That's not how the system works. Our founding fathers knew that you needed to have compromise, you needed to find middle ground. Our founding fathers, James Madison in particular, but all of them, were fearful of what they called factions, which today we would call political parties. They thought factions could very well lead to the downfall of this new republic that they had created. And they said Congress needs to act outside of factions and think about what's just best for the country. And that's where we're at now. We continue on this course. We saw a very contentious election. I don't want to see an even more contentious one in 4 years. I don't think we advance as a country if that's the case. This is a rare opportunity. It's going to take strong leadership, and it's going to take leadership willing to do that, but I'm always hopeful.
Is it possible that because Mr. Trump was certainly not the choice of many of the Republican members of the House or the Senate, they would have preferred a more mainstream candidate. Is it possible because of that he might have more freedom to come to, say, you, and say, here's an issue that you and I agree on, and be able to form a more bipartisan coalition, since he may not be as married to a party?
Well, certainly I think there's an opportunity for Mr. Trump to do that, and to reach across the aisle to Democrats and try to find some common ground. This will be, we don't know. I mean, there's a lot of unknowns right now. There were a lot of unknowns about the actual policies that Mr. Trump would pursue. That was certainly a criticism that we heard throughout the campaign, that he identified problems, but he never talked about what sort of solutions that he would actually work on. So here's an opportunity for him to really approach this with he's approaching it with a fairly blank slate. So now fill in that slate. And I believe that if he fills it in, showing that he's willing to work in a cooperative way and try to find compromise, and realize that ideas, regardless of where they may come from, that there are good Republican ideas, there are good Democratic ideas, so let's forget the partisan labels and let's focus on just what are good ideas. I think this is a real opportunity for him, but the jury's out, and we'll have to see what happens.
We started this interview and you said it shows that this country is divided. I think, I'll use my words, I would say deeply divided. There are two different sets of voters. There is one set of voters who I will call the President Obama, Hillary Clinton voters, who said this is a track we're on and a track we want to continue on. There's another set of voters that identified, at least in some level, with the things that President-elect Trump said, that he wanted to repeal and replace Obamacare, that he wanted to build a wall, that he wanted to do any number of things that would be quite separate and apart from what this other set of voters might want. How did we get to be so evenly but deeply divided?
Well, I don't know how we got here, and I suppose there's a lot of different explanations that could explain that. I think the important thing now, though, is to try to figure out how do we move forward away from that. And so if you're looking at something like the health care, and certainly the comments that President-elect Trump has made about that, we can make things better. So if it's about how do we find places where the Affordable Care Act is not working, and let's make it better, and if that's his idea of a replacement with better ideas, then let's explore that. Whether or not, if his idea is just to eliminate health care coverage for folks who have gotten it under the Affordable Care Act, and in Michigan, you're talking about 800,000 people who now have health care that didn't have it before. I don't think that's going to be received well by anybody if suddenly 800,000 people don't have the ability to have affordable quality health care. So it is about trying to find that middle ground. Where can we go together in the middle? But it has to start with a basic premise that everybody agrees on. And I hope that basic premise is that everybody in this country, no matter who you are, no matter where you live, should have access to quality, affordable health care. And if we can agree on that, that's a big start. And now it's about the specific policies that get us there, and there's going to be give and take, and what's the best way to accomplish that. But let's first rally around that common premise, which I think is important. And I think every American would agree that everybody should have access to affordable quality health care. Other countries around the world do it. We can certainly do it in the United States. I believe we are an incredibly smart country. But we have to have the political will to rally around that basic premise and then make the kinds of changes necessary, or keep the things that are working. Celebrate what's working and fix what's not. That's just good old-fashioned, common sense, practical solutions or problem solving.
8 years ago, Republicans said almost from the day President Obama was elected that they were not going to cooperate. And Democrats have accused them, and rightfully so in many cases, of being obstructionist. Now, with a very narrow majority in the Senate, Democrats have the ability to keep Republicans from getting to 60 votes anytime they want to. Are you concerned that the label of obstructionist that has been laid with the Republicans could come back on Democrats if in fact there are policies that you can't agree with this president?
Well, I think there'll be policies that you can't agree with. That's part of the political process, and so there are certain things that are going to be probably very difficult to try to find some common ground. But that's why I think it's important early on to be able to build trust, to be able to build a working relationship, is to focus on some of the things that I believe, would be easier to find that common ground, as I've mentioned in the past. Infrastructure is an example of that. So I think you've got to start building that trust. There's part of this contentious election is that there's not a lot of trust, and that includes the factions of people in this country. A democracy is not healthy, and it can't function if there's not a basic level of trust. And all these other debates, to me, are noise if there's not basic trust that we can build from. This is a moment we are expecting, and I would say this regardless of who was elected on Election Day. We have President-elect Trump, but same thing with if it was President-elect Clinton we were talking about. Job number one of the new president has to be building trust in this country and healing what we have seen as what I think is a destructive process to our basic democracy. If we're not about healing that right now, we're going to have even bigger problems going forward. Any short-term gain that one political party or the other thinks that they can achieve will be at the expense of this country long-term, and we have to start thinking that way.
That's the view from a Democrat in the upper chamber. What about the U.S. House, and how are Republicans feeling? We'll have that next. To the point. Welcome back to the Point. Well, after this big election of 2016, the question is, what does governance look like going forward? Now a view from the House side and Republican Bill Huizenga. Congressman, we've just completed one of the most unusual elections that I have ever observed. I've been watching for a long time. But the question isn't so much, and we can certainly discuss the outcomes and all those, but my interest is, how do we go forward? What does governance look like? Because you have a Republican president with a Republican House and a Republican Senate. But President-elect Trump was not the choice of many of your colleagues, Republicans in the House. The majority in the Senate is not big enough to overcome the Democrats' objections. They don't have 60 votes, in other words. So what does governance look like when you go back in January?
Yeah, and I want to start with the phrase that you used, which is, how do we move forward? And I want to commend President Obama and even Secretary Clinton on how they handled that. And as I said, election night, we're going to need some graceful winners and some graceful losers to be able to start moving on. And I got to tell you, Rick, I am hugely frustrated with what's happening out in the streets of people protesting and saying that this is somehow illegitimate and all that kind of stuff. They are literally protesting democracy. in my opinion. And it's ridiculous. And I don't remember those kinds of protests happening in 2008 when, when there was a huge sea shift in society. So, we've got to get beyond that. I think it's true leaders need to start healing that. And then we start looking at, okay, what legislatively is going to be happening? And little history lesson, yes, as you were starting to point out, the Republicans don't have 60 votes, which is exactly what the Democrats had in Barack Obama's first 2 years. And, that's when Ted Kennedy died. That put that Massachusetts race suddenly right in the international eye. So what does it look like? I think for us in the House, we have a comprehensive plan that we have put together called A Better Way that I was campaigning on, a lot of my colleagues were campaigning on. It's the nuts and bolts of how do we repeal and replace Obamacare? How do we deal with a tax code that needs to be reformed? How do we deal with border integrity and national security? We have 67 very specific points. How do we restore the constitutional powers to their proper balance? So that's some of what we're looking at trying to do, and it's going to be much easier for the House to move its agenda with Donald Trump at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and vice versa for him. The tricky part will be the Senate to see what's going to happen there.
I talked to Senator Gary Peters, and he said almost the first thing that he went to, he started talking about infrastructure. As you know, President-elect Trump has a very ambitious plan over a 10-year period. And the interesting part about infrastructure is that it impacts all 435 congressional districts.
Yep.
And it is something that virtually every district needs, right? We need roads and bridges, but more important perhaps is what we don't see. It's the not so sexy replacement of underground pipes and sewers and the grid and all of those kind of things. That's a place where you might come up with some agreement. So you think, okay, that's interesting, but it's $1 trillion. Mm-hmm. So the real problem is going to be, even if you find agreement, how do you pay for it?
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what I was going to point out. The real question is, how are we going to pay for it? That is, I don't envision the Republicans going along in the House and the Senate with a, quote unquote, stimulus two. $1 trillion stimulus that didn't stimulate as much as had been promised and advertised. Many of us thought it wouldn't work quite the way that they had hoped. So you're right, at the end of the day, with a $20 trillion debt and Donald Trump talking about concern of that $20 trillion debt, how we pay for it moving forward has to be part of his equation, and we'll have to work that out with all sides of the aisle.
When Donald Trump speaks, he stops and lets people finish his thought. And one of the things he says is, "We will build," and the crowd scream, "A wall." Republicans in the House do not seem terribly excited about building a physical wall. At least my perception is. Is that something that can happen?
Some are. Some have enthusiastically embraced that. I think most of us have always held the position that a wall, physical and virtual, needs to be put in place because we need to have border integrity. That really is a key element. Can you get border integrity not just with a physical, pick the height, 8 foot, 10 foot, 12 foot, it could be 50-foot wall. At some point or another, somebody's going to be able to either get over it, around it, or under it. But can you have the same effect with a virtual wall? And I've argued all along, we absolutely could. We've got technology like drones and motion sensors and all those things. Doing some practical things. We do something here that is not so smart. We declare federal lands right up to the border, and then the Interior Department refuses to allow Customs and Border Patrol to drive up and down the border because it's on pristine land. It's like, well, okay, well, guess what? Those coming across the border illegally know that they're not patrolling there. So where do you think they go? Right there. So there's some practical things, just common sense things that we can do, I think, to enhance that as well. But we're going to have to work, in my mind, that is everything with E-Verify and with employers to a physical wall in certain areas of that border, where it does make sense.
There is a divide in this country that was put on exhibition during this campaign and verified by those vote totals. They were that close. 10 or 11,000 votes in Michigan that had it going for Donald Trump for the first time since 1988. What is it that divides us? What brought us to this almost equally divided chasm between people who voted for Trump and people who voted for Hillary Clinton?
Yeah. Well, you know, and the interesting thing is, I think, sort of taking one step further back, you look at where those blue states are. They tend to be the coasts, and here in the upper Midwest, I mean, Wisconsin, for crying out loud, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, going for Donald Trump. Obviously, the exception to that would be Illinois. You know, that's pretty unusual. So when people talk about this popular vote versus the number of states that went for it, there was some real wisdom in the Electoral College that the Founding Fathers had. But how do we overcome that divide? I said this when I was in the state legislature, and I've said it when I've been in Washington, D.C. It takes leadership and relationships. It takes trust built on relationships. President Obama did not have those relationships and therefore never built trust, even within his own party, in the House and in the Senate oftentimes. Certainly didn't with the House of Representatives and the Republicans. And I'm hoping that Donald Trump, one, is building those relationships within his own party so we can sort of stop the circular firing squad that sometimes is called the Republican Party. But then also starts building those relationships with others in the House and in the Senate who aren't of his party, so that we can actually get together. And the one thing there is that, you know, Bill Clinton had a reputation for was a reputation for crossing the aisle and trying to build those relationships so that he and Newt Gingrich could work together. So I'm hoping that Donald Trump is going to be able to work very closely with Paul Ryan and with Mitch McConnell and with the Democrat leaders as well to figure out whether it's 5%, 15%, or 50% of what we can agree on. Let's at least make sure that we're able to get going on that. And as you pointed out earlier, infrastructure might be one of those first starting spots.
Final question, and I wonder if this makes a difference. Donald Trump was not the establishment Republican Party choice for a nominee. Does that make it easier for him to go talk to Democrats without worrying about the repercussions of you know, the base or whatever you want to call it being angry with him, because he kind of did it on his own anyway?
Yeah. Well, the question is what's establishment, right? Many would argue Ted Cruz was not establishment, and he won my congressional district with almost 40% of the vote. That's one of the reasons why I got engaged as strong as I did, was to make sure that those Ted Cruz voters and others who were not part of the establishment, but were not Donald Trump fans, understood that this wasn't about 4 years in a term of presidency, but really about 40-year impact with those Supreme Court appointments and things like that. And it looks like they came home, quote unquote, at the end of the day for the most part. And so, you know, does he have a certain amount of freedom? He's been pretty flexible. I mean, he's given money to Democrats and Republicans over the years. Hopefully he's going to be able to have those relationships coming out of New York, for example. I mean, he's known Chuck Schumer for a very long time. So hopefully he's going to be able to bridge some of those chasms in an unconventional way that maybe most more traditional Republicans wouldn't be able to do.
So what happens next? After the inauguration and after all of the festivities, it will be time to lead the country. What will President Donald Trump do? What will Republicans in the House do? How will Democrats in the Senate try to counteract any of that? It could be a very interesting run, and we'll be watching all of it right here. We'll be back with more To the Point. It's undeniable that Decision 2016 was one of the most jarring elections that we've seen in a long time. Fully half of the country is unhappy about the outcome. But what happens going forward will be more important than the election itself, and that's what we'll be tracking for the next 4 years. I hope you'll join us right here, To the Point.